I do want to point out that Finland has perhaps the most heavy metal bands in the world per capita, and also ranks high on good governance. I don't know that there's any correlation there.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If the two of you would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hey, I'm Markus. I'm author of the Rotting Ways to Misery book. I also play some death metal bass and vocals thingy in Sadistik Forest and Nerve Soul.
I'm Kim, and I'm the author of Rotting Ways to Misery as well. And Used to be in bands like Festerday and Oceans, but nowadays I have a couple of new bands like Black Acid World and Chaos Goat, and we have also a band together with Markus called
Oh, that's right.
Extreme Excrement Experiment, and then I have another industrial black metal band called Just Acid, and then I have a punk band called Distortion, and I'm also involved in the new old school death metal black metal band called The Mist from the Mountains. So I'm basically in 6 bands at the moment. So yeah.
I should point out that Markus was also in the band Hooded Menace.
Yeah, I used to be in Hooded Menace from 2012 to 2017.
So, two guys who know a lot about Finnish death metal wrote a book about Finnish death metal. Let's start with how you guys know each other. Did you meet through working on the book, or did you guys know each other through the scene?
We got contact and started seriously talking, because of the book. Around 2017, Kim came to contact me because he has been planning the same kind of a book. And he had heard that I was doing a Finnish death metal book, planning it and collecting materials. So we started talking and decided, there's no point to create 2 similar books. So instead we thought maybe we should do one together. And then, so it would be more thorough, faster to create, and then have a lot of, because we're also a little bit of different generation. So Kim was there right in the beginning, and I formed my first death metal band in 1995 when the Finnish scene had already died, a number of death. So we started talking about. I knew Kim for since the late 90s through his music, because I was a big fan of And Oceans, and then went to see them play and all that. I saw them play first time in 1998. So, I knew them. I knew Kim for a long time, but we didn't talk seriously before the book project started.
Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
No, actually, that's pretty much how it went, because there wasn't much ongoing before we started seriously thinking about this book. And as Markus said, it actually all came around when we seriously started to talk about what to do, because we were both doing the same shit. So it was easier to put our heads together and start the collaboration in that way.
Now, what part of Finland are you each in? Are you close to each other?
There's about 5-6 hours in between. So I'm quite in the middle. If you put your finger right in the middle of Finland, that's where I'm at. So nearest big town is Kuopio, and Kuopio is 1 hour away. So I'm on 1 hour north from Kuopio.
And I'm in the southern part of, close to Helsinki.
Okay. So tell me when you guys each started working on this book and when you started collaborating.
I started planning the book around 2015 because I had been waiting for somebody to take on the project since the Swedish death metal book came out. It was a tremendous book, and I was kind of thinking that there's so many stories in the Finnish scene, that should be told, and somebody should seriously write a book about it. And I waited and waited and waited, and around 2015, I started to be a little bit impatient because I asked around and nobody was interested. So I started thinking, what if I should do it myself then? So that's how it started.
I was thinking about doing this book when we reformed Festerday. I think it was in 2013 or 14. And that's when our original drummer came back to Festerday, and he's an author as well. So, and really into old school death metal. So we were talking with him about doing this book, but he had so much other projects ongoing, so he dropped out. And I was thinking that, well, fuck, I have to do this shit all of myself on my own. And then a year later or two, Markus came in, and that's pretty much where it all started.
So Markus made reference to Daniel Ekeroth's book, Swedish Death Metal, as the impetus for wanting to create a similar book about Finnish death metal. Was that also present in your mind? Did that influence your decision, Kim?
The book itself didn't influence me, but even if it is a really good book, but I was more like influenced by Feral House production from USA. They have a lot of different, like absurd books, and that was pretty much how I wanted to make the death metal book look like. But the inspiration itself, I think it mainly came from the old school, that people from the scene that I knew from when I was like 12 or 13 started to die. And I was like, when this scene is dead and my friends are pretty much going to die pretty soon. So I think the inspiration comes from that part, that now it's now or never.
Yeah, and then structure-wise, if you look at the Daniel Ekeroth's book, it's structured a little bit differently than our book. So more like the book's structural inspiration was more like Dial Patterson's Cult Never Dies, the evolution of the cult book, and then Choosing Death. So I think structure-wise, we were more inspired by other books. The idea that somebody wrote a book about Swedish death metal, as far as ideas go, was important in the creation of the book itself.
Now, had either of you written a book before this?
Yes.
This was my first. I had been a music journalist before, but this was my first full book.
Kim, would you mind telling me what books you've written before?
I wrote a children's book some years ago, mainly as a pragmatic thing for, the kindergarten. And that's pretty much where it started. When I was 15, I was thinking about, when I grow up, I want to do 3 books. So now I made 2 and there's 1 to go.
That's interesting to me. Why was this a goal of yours, to write 3 books?
I don't know. There's a saying that you can't call yourself an author before you have written 3 books.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about the format of the book. You guys talked about it briefly, but the full name of the book is Rotting Ways to Misery, The History of Finnish Death Metal. And as you mentioned, it seems to follow the format of Albert Mudrian's book, Choosing Death, in the sense that it's both an overview and a history of the book with quotes from the major players, as well as people from outside the scene commenting on the scene. Was this always the goal? Was it always the plan to take the point of view of as many people as possible?
I think the goal was to write about the scene of 1988 to 1994, more or less, and future as much as we could from it, to paint a picture of how it was back in the day, and what the guys were thinking, and how it was to play death metal in Finland around those days. So we wanted to have even the more obscure band at least mentioned, if not interviewed. So the idea was that when somebody reads the book, he has quite thorough knowledge of the bands that existed here, because the scene itself was really small. So it was quite, it was actually possible to have more than 90% of the bands, to feature. So yeah, it was the plan from right at the beginning to be as thorough and, interview the people with, well, of course, the scene is small, so we knew who would be, into talking about it. So, and who would have good points of view. So we kind of handpicked the guys who we knew who could deliver smart and then representative answers from that time.
And having those additional people adding things about what they think about Finnish death metal, I think that was a kind of a big thing for us, because I never thought we could have people like that saying that, hey, I listened to the first Sentence demo when I was blah, blah, blah. And to have them covered and featured in the book, I think it's very essential.
Yeah, it was important to have people from outside Finland to comment about the Finnish death metal scene itself, to create another perspective. We wanted to avoid the situation where the Finnish guys each pat each other's backs, I really like Demolish, but so we thought more, to find people from outside Finland to spoke about how they saw the phenomenon and then which bands they really thought would be the best to represent the sound of the time.
Now, was this outside perspective important to you just for context and just for a different point of view?
I think it was important, to paint the picture how Finnish death metal how it was received globally. Because in Finland, Finnish death metal has always been misunderstood a bit. If you listen to mainstream metal, even mainstream metal people in Finland don't really know how globally appreciated Finnish death metal was back in the day. Because, none of the bands were on major labels or anything. So, well, besides Amorphis maybe. But, so we wanted to, first of all, to remind people here that the Finnish death metal was a globally received and perceived phenomenon. But we also wanted to have another dimension in the dialogue because of having those people from outside Finland to tell how they came across with the sound and how they felt about it.
And having those people just telling us what they feel and think about Finnish death metal was kind of a bonus for us. It was nothing we had planned in that way.
Now, tell me about these people. Tell me about the people that you interviewed for the book, both within the scene and outside the scene.
Markus, go ahead.
well, I think from outside the Finnish scene, my most rewarding experiences were talking to Chris Reifert from Autopsy and then from Tompa from At the Gate, So because these guys really surprised me about their, how thorough their level of knowledge for Finnish death metal was. Chris Reifert knew really, really obscure bands who had just released like 7-inch or a demo. And then stuff that, people in Finland don't take for, might not know. And same with Tompa. He had followed already the Finnish hardcore scene. So he was quite familiar from, say, mid-80s of what was going on in Finland too. So it was really rewarding to speak to these two guys especially because, they just surprised me and they were really like a real underground metal warriors, even though they are quite in a huge band at the moment.
And same was as when it comes to outside people. Afterwards, when the book was released, I think the appreciation from people that are not even listening to metal music anymore, but they were listening to it when they were like kids, and they still come to me and say that, hey, fuck man, it was brilliant to read that book that I remember Sentenced when I was 13 years old and so on. This brings back memories from the past. So in that sense, this is, yeah.
Besides the knowledge of obscure bands, did anything else surprise you as you were doing these interviews?
I think the biggest, surprise for me was to actually realize how young everybody was at the time. Like the oldest guys, like the guys from Disgrace, were about 20, and everybody else was younger than that. So it was really a teenage phenomenon in Finland. So most of the guys, weren't even allowed to drive a car or buy alcohol here. And still they were making albums that are still today, remember. Like Demolish's album, for example, I think guys composed it when they were 17. So, and it's still kind of like a one-of-a-kind death metal album still today. So I think that was really awe-inspiring, to see And it also might be that the Finland in early 90s was a quite boring place because these guys sure seem to have spent a lot of time in the rehearsal room.
And also when it comes to venues, when we started Festerday, I was like, we made our first demo when I was 13 or something, and we were not allowed to venues because we were too young. So we couldn't play our first gigs at some venues. So that tells how young people were actually at that moment.
There are some great posters and flyers from those days where, there's quite exotic places where the bands are playing. Like there's one with Beherit, Convol, and Sentenced playing in Spa in Nokia. So that really, it wasn't that perfectly organized in the beginning.
Yeah, it was mainly, you were playing like, what do you call these, where youngsters hang around these places? Not youth hostels. What do they call youth hostels? Youth.
Or youth centers, yeah.
Youth centers, yeah. Those were the main places to play, actually.
So you may have to explain what youth centers are to people around the world, because I don't think we have them in the rest of the world like you guys have them in Europe. Can you explain briefly what a youth center is?
I think it could be a Scandinavian phenomenon where city or municipality provides some kind of a gathering location for people under 18 who cannot, in Finland, under 18 who cannot go to bars or stuff like that. And because it's also cold in Scandinavia in wintertime, so it's pretty depressing to stand outside talking to your friends when it's minus 35. So these are like buildings where people who are not 18 of the drinking age can go and hang around, and they usually have discos or band happenings or stuff like that where, so there was entertainment for these kids.
And they have like pool tables and rehearsal places for bands, and they arrange gigs at those. And yeah, it's a place where you build some sort of a community.
And they had the strange distinction of becoming places where, well, at least in Europe, they became places where a lot of the underground scenes throughout Europe started growing, because they were some of the only places that allowed these very underground, very raw, hardcore and death metal and black metal bands to actually rehearse and play, right?
That's correct. That's right, and there were also a lot of rehearsal rooms in general. So they could be the only, proper rehearsal rooms in town. So that's where, a lot of, like, for example, when I was talking to guys from Mordicus from Joensuu, they had like one big youth center where all the bands were rehearsing at. So that's where also the musicians met, and that's where they formed new bands and stuff like that. So yes, they were providing rehearsal rooms, but there's also this thing, because they're kind of like by city or government organized, there could be also a bit of censorship, especially when black metal came around. I remember when my band, we had to go to interview if we were Satanists or if we were worshipping Satan in the rehearsal room. So there was also a little bit of censorship, because of course they were worried for the kids basically. So yeah, it was both. They provided rehearsal rooms, but the most morbid kind of band would still have to find another place to rehearse.
And when when the administrators asked you if you worship Satan, what was your answer?
Of course.
Well, the band at the time, where I was at, so we were more like a Thigh Serpent kind of a band at the time. This was in 1998. And the reason why the interview came was because Kim's band and Oceans was in town with Barathrum, and there was a huge, there was a lot of bullshit in the newspapers about it's kind of like a satanic dread going on in the town where I was studying at the time because of that particular show where, you know, there was a lot of shock antiques on stage. So the reason why they were interviewing my band was because Kim was playing in town. But yeah, the band where I was at the time was more like Thigh Serpent, kind of a dark metal kind of a thing. So I could show them the lyrics. They spoke more about, you know, the woods, and
Jesus.
of course they were anti-Christian elements in the music, but you know, it was not, you know, they didn't find any burned Bibles from the floor or anything.
It was too cryptic. The lyrics were too
Maybe
cryptic.
they just couldn't speak. Maybe they just couldn't speak English.
How did you break down the delegation of labor? How did you decide who was going to interview who and who was going to write what?
Well, this was kind of, it came with time when we started doing it. It was quite convenient for Kim to talk to most of the people because from the Finnish early thing, because he had basically all their numbers in his phone. So he could just call guys from Demigod or stuff like that. Because I'm a little bit younger, so there were people I hadn't met. I had met most of them, but there were still people I didn't know personally. So Kim was our journalist in this one, so he went through a lot of the original death metal bands. Whereas I was quite well aware of the northern thrash metal bands of the 80s. So I went through RG and National Napalm Syndicate, and well, basically, the guy who knew the band best spoke to them. That was more or less how it went.
And I knew most of these a bit older bands from my past with Festerday and the time when I was pen paling with most of the bands, trading rehearsal tapes and 7 inches and magazines and so on. So I kind of had them all on my Facebook as friends and as well on WhatsApp and so forth. So it was pretty easy to just call them up and say, hey, we're working on something like this. So would you mind to answer a couple of questions? So that was not the kind of a problem at all, because somewhat I knew them all from the past. So
Now, within the scene, what was the reaction when people found out you were working on this project? Was there excitement? Were people glad that there was finally a book about Finnish death metal coming out?
I think the response was quite enthusiastic for most of the cases there, and then people really took up to the subject, and they really wanted to talk about it, because I think vast majority of the people understood that it's important to have it all written down at some point. So most of the people we contacted were enthusiastic about it. Only like handful of people didn't want to take part, and that was mainly because they couldn't remember anything from the old days. So that was so they were afraid that they might say something wrong. So that was probably the biggest reason why some people didn't want to participate. But all in all, most of the people were really happy that there's a book like this coming up.
Kim, do you want to add anything?
now I I agree totally on that one, because people were kind of waiting for it when we started to not promote it, but telling friends that we are working on something like this. And it kind of got this kind of a big loop riding around when people started to talk about it and contacting us, and are you really working on something like that, and why is not my band featured, and so on. But we have made certain restrictions to what will be featured and what we will leave out.
And by leaving out, it means they are mentioned, but not
interviewed.
So your explanation of bands not wanting to take part because they weren't sure they could accurately remember the history is funny to me, because not long ago I interviewed a gentleman in a Finnish grindcore band who told me that alcohol is a big part of his band's process, whether it's writing or recording or playing shows. So I'm assuming that's part of the reason why people have trouble remembering. Is that fair?
That's the biggest reason. That's the biggest reason.
And I think there are also a lot of people from the old scene, when they stopped playing around 93, 94, 95, and they sold all their equipment and never looked back again. And now 25 years later, 30 years later, they kind of don't even remember that they have played in the band, because it was not a big deal for them at that time either. But to us, again, we have been living and breathing this inhumane source of evil since we were kids. So to us, this is pretty much natural.
Is there anybody either within the scene or from outside who you really wanted to speak to that you didn't get a chance to?
Well, of course, there are people who are not around us anymore. So those were, of course.
Meaning people who passed away, right?
Yeah. So it would have been, there were definitely been, interesting people to talk about, and talk with, but that's one regret that we obviously couldn't do. And then, we didn't want to, bask too much on their passing either. So their passing is rather mentioned in the book, and we didn't want to go to details out of the respect, because their passing was not actually had nothing to do with the music itself. So we didn't want to go for the shock value on those cases.
Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's pretty much how it was, because I had a couple of bands that I was interested in interviewing, but the vocalist died some years before and so forth. So it's, nothing you can do about that.
So you mentioned Albert Mudrian's Choosing Death. In Choosing Death, Mudrian actually, he wrote about both death metal and grindcore, since both scenes were developing concurrently and influencing each other at the same time. And, you mentioned shows with Beharit and some of the black metal bands that were coming out. As you were writing about Finnish death metal, did you feel any responsibility to talk about some of the other musical scenes that were happening in Finland at the time? For example, the black metal scene or the grindcore scene?
Or the rap scene.
Or the rap scene, yeah. Or the folk music scene?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we felt that it's somehow important to paint a little bit of picture of what there was, or mainly what there was not, before death metal in Finland. So we go through the very few aggressive bands Finland had, because in mid 80s, if you spoke about extreme music in Finland, that meant hardcore punk. So Finland really wasn't a metal country until very late 80s. So I felt it was, and we spoke about this a lot, so we felt it's mandatory to a little bit to paint picture, of the late 80s Finland as far as, extreme metal goes, because there really wasn't much. And then, so it was quite possible to have them all the aggressive bands covered in the introduction. So I think that thrash metal, the more extreme, morbid kind of, and like Sacred Crucifix and Phlegethon, ARG, that they were really, we felt they were important to be mentioned, because like on Sacred Crucifix case, it's almost death metal already. Well, of course, there were bands like Beharit and Impaled Nazarene who basically were almost death metal when they started, but they are more known from their black metal albums. So we felt it wasn't necessary to have those guys on board.
And there was also already a big book written about Finnish black metal previously, before this Rotting Ways to Misery book, which was called Cradle of something. I don't remember. The Devil's Cradle, yeah. And instead of featuring those same bands, I think that would be kind of, stepping on the same toes again. So I think it was better that there was also a really good book about punk music scene in Finland done previously. So instead of having any other music genres involved, we thought it would be better to just concentrate on death metal and where it began. And it came from thrash more than it came from black metal anyway. So, and when in the beginning of the late 80s, early 90s, death and black metal were kind of in the same kind of a box. There were a couple of black metal bands that were standing more out as black metal bands, like, Archgoat, Beharit, and Impaled Nazarene, but they had a lot of death metal kind of feeling and this kind of approach to death at same level as death metal had. It was later when death metal started to be nature friendly and talk about ecosystems and. But in the beginning, it was all the same mash.
At what point did Cult Never Dies get involved with this project?
Cult Never Dies came on board like 2 years before the release, I think. They were mapping out people who would be interested of if there would be a Finnish death metal book who would like to take part, because they obviously they wanted to have that kind of a book written. And when they learned about that, we were already long way ahead doing it, so it kind of made a lot of sense, to once again to collaborate and work with them. And it was also personally, it was really rewarding. As I said in the beginning, Dial's book Evolution of the Cult was huge personal inspiration as far as the informative nature of my extreme metal book goes. So it was great to have actually direct contact with Dial Patterson and speak to him about and to have his views, what he thought would be important and what not, involved.
And same way, it feels a bit stupid to have a foreigner to write about Finnish death metal if they have not even lived when that shit was happening, instead of having us doing it, who lives and breathes the same system all the time. So it was easier for us, in my opinion, to do it. I wouldn't go and do a book about Birmingham hardcore scene from the 80s. I don't know shit what happened except what I have been reading. But I didn't live in Birmingham, or I didn't, it's a bit different. It's the same coin kind of a way, but it's the other side of the coin.
And also, what I think was important to get people to talk more freely and more thoroughly
in their mother tongue.
We could do the interviews in Finnish, so we just translated them later on. But it actually made people. When Finnish people talk English, they kind of cut down, the substance a bit. So they probably don't want to go as in depth. Of course, because it's not their normal way to speak, So I think it was really important to have Finnish guys to do the interviews in Finnish.
If we would have done the book in English with the Finnish bands, you would have 300 pages of yes and no answers.
So it would be like your average zine interview? Just yes and no?
Yeah. more or less. Yeah. If you look at the scenes from back in time, they were probably more enthusiastic than they were grammatically correct.
When people talk about certain regional scenes, a lot of times they're talking about a sound. Like when, for example, when people say, Swedish death metal,
Florida,
or exactly Florida death metal, they're talking about a certain style, a certain sound. Would you say that there's a sound associated with Finnish death metal?
I really don't think so. Finnish bands really wanted to separate, be different to each other. It was held in high regard not to sound like the next band. So I think there being no common sound was the definition of Finnish death metal, I would say.
Yeah, and even if bands knew each other, we didn't have one big studio or a big producer where everyone wanted to go. They all wanted to test out their regional own studios, and therefore the sound was pretty different from each one another.
Yeah, that's true. And most of these studios weren't really equipped for death metal. So this is why also the sounds are very much different to each other, because they have different kind of equipment, were actually made for recording totally different kind of music. So this adds a little bit of a weird factor to some of the cases.
Now, sometimes within a regional scene, there's a little bit of a push-pull with a nearby scene, like, for example, with New York hardcore and Boston hardcore, or Swedish black metal and Norwegian black metal. You know, sometimes there's a little bit of competition and a little bit of a drive to stand out or to be more extreme than what's happening nearby. Did Finland have a similar kind of relationship with any of the nearby countries, any of the other Nordic countries?
Well, I think in the beginning the Swedish scene was important because they got started a little bit earlier on. You know, the nihilist demos and Grave and, you know, bands like that. But I think the biggest influence Swedish scene had, that because Swedish scene started sounding a lot like, you know, all the bands started to sound a lot like each other in the quite early stages of the, you know, Swedish scene. So that, I think that too reflected on Finland in a manner that bands here didn't really want to have that kind of a similar HM2 type of a direct, like something that would define when you hear a Swedish band for, you know, 15 seconds, you know it is a Swedish band. So I think Finnish bands kind of like reflected on that, and they didn't want to have that. So instead they wanted all to find a little bit their own angle on the thing.
And also kind of a more of a unique sound to their own, instead of doing a replica of some Swedish sound, like, you know, Entombed or Dismember. And of course, the HM2 was coming in later on, but that was pretty much when the Finnish death metal scene was already dead.
And also, Finnish bands were maybe more influenced by British bands like Carcass and Napalm Death, Bolt Thrower, a bit more than they probably were influenced by Swedish bands.
And that's probably because of the Finnish hardcore punk scene was really big in the 80s in Finland, and Birmingham and kind of this filthy sound of hardcore also reflected on the Finnish death metal as well.
Would you guys mind giving me a brief overview of the history of Finnish death metal? Like, would you be able to cite a starting point and maybe a particularly influential release, like a demo or album that came out that launched the scene?
Well, I think, you know, it all started, the first signs of death metal started to appear in the area of Turku, that's on the southern west coast of Finland. And that was mainly because Turku has a daily ferry connection to Stockholm. And kids from Turku went more often to Stockholm than they would go to Helsinki. So when kids from Turku started traveling to Stockholm, of course they went to the record stores and they started to find those demos from Sweden. And then they started to get in contact with the band. And then the three very first death metal bands in Finland, I would say, were all from Turku area, being Funeber, Disgrace, and Xysma. And many people agree that it was, you know, the first Funeber demo, Cranial Torment, that was the very first Finnish death metal release that was full-on death metal and didn't have any thrash metal in it any longer.
And there were a lot of people outside Turku, for example, in Helsinki and Vaasa regions. We went to Turku to see death metal because there weren't any death metal scene south in Finland or north in Finland.
So when did this Funebre album come out?
Funeber demo came out in, I think, 1989, and then their only album came out, I think, in 1991. And the first Finnish full album, there were 4 of them that came out in 1991. Xysma, Sentenced, first album, Shadows of the Past, Funeber, Children of the Corn, and Convul, World Without God. And then they came out pretty early when you think of the global timeline in death metal too. So I think 1991 was before the big boom, when there started to be shitloads of death metal bands around the globe. So in a way, it all escalated pretty quickly in Finland if the first proper death metal demo, that was full-on death metal, came out in 1989, so to a point that the bands were all ready to record full album in 2 years. So I think the timeline was really quick. And what's also funny is that Xysma, who released the first album, full album of death metal in Finland, that was there, in 1991, that was already a band that was bored to play death metal. So I think the first Finnish death metal album was actually created by a band who was already looking to something else musically, and therefore there's a lot of these Black Sabbath groovy kind of things in Xysma, which makes it quite exceptional album too.
So you mentioned Turku in the south. Were there any other cities that had thriving death metal scenes?
So I think Turku was the main place in the beginning, and there was a venue, Panimo, where, the very first death metal shows in Finland were held. But, well, a little bit later, Helsinki started to have their own bands. There were a couple in Joensuu, even though the scene in Joensuu was really small. Kuopio had Messiah, Paratroops, and Demolition. But of course, in the north, Oulu was important because, they had Sentenced, Belial, Mythos, and then, of course, Impaled Nazarene too. So, if you think of Oulu was a big town for metal in the very beginning of extreme metal in Finland.
And also on the west coast in Vaasa area, there was Cartilage, Vomituration, Misanthropia, Wings, Festerday, Carnifex, and this was happening pretty quickly. Everything when they kind of they started to pop up all over the country.
When I first heard about Finnish death metal, it was mostly, or I guess just Finnish metal in general, I basically found out about it through Amorphis. And for a long time, the band that you heard most about in terms of the Finnish metal scene or the Finnish death metal scene was Amorphis. We're almost 50 minutes into our conversation, and Amorphis hasn't really come up at all. Tell me, as a longtime Amorphis fan, exactly how important was Amorphis to the scene?
Amorphis actually came out a little bit later when you think of the timeline in Finnish death metal. They had abhorrence going on, more or less the same people. And then before that, there was a band called Violent Solution. And then these Violent Solution and Abhorrence were one of those very early Finnish extreme metal bands. And then when Abhorrence turned into Amorphis, they already, the Finnish scene was already going and full stride at the time. So, but, the importance of Amorphis, but when they released the Karelian Isthmus, they took, the very underground phenomenon and made it, more aware. Amorphis were definitely the band that made Finnish death metal known outside, the very small scene that was the death metal scene itself. So, yeah, it was definitely Amorphis that, took the thing and marketed to a lot of new people. And then without Amorphis, I'm sure quite a many Finnish death metal bands wouldn't be as widely known as they are today. And I have to mention here Sentenced. They also went to be a little bit more commercial with time. But people often forget, that Sentenced were one of the very first death metal bands in Finland. And then, so they had already been creating quite unique and distinctive death metal before they started going to the more gothic dimension they are more known about. But people sometimes still today are a bit, surprised when they find out that Sentenced was actually a quite brilliant death metal band in the beginning.
And also with the second Amorphis album, they really kind of leveled it up, the whole death metal, when it came out. And I think that was in like 92 or something, 92, 93, 92, I think. And a lot of young death metal bands were actually appreciating what the second Amorphis album was all about, because it was pretty much more melodic compared to the older ones. And it kind of break the neck of the whole scene when they started to market Amorphis' second album. And 2 years after that, everything was pretty much already going downward spiral in death metal in Finland.
Yeah, when the Tales from the Dazzled Lakes came out in 1994, it was really make it or break it time for Finnish death metal, because a lot of people they either needed to reinvent their band like Amorphis did, or simply just quit, because death metal itself had kind of like came to an end as it was known in the beginning around the times of Tales from the Dazzled Lakes. So that's for some, maybe largely to people who were used to be teens, were now at the time to go into study. In Finland, we have mandatory military service, so they were signing it in for the army. And then there were a lot of reasons why these formerly 16 years old dudes started to be now 20-something. And maybe death metal was seen by a little bit by some kind of a teenage morbidity, obscurity. So they wanted to branch out a bit or simply just abandon the subject.
Yeah, and when it comes to the military service, I think that's one of the groundbreaking things when death metal was actually kind of decaying day by day, because a lot of people who came out of the military service, they didn't want to pick up the drumsticks or guitar anymore after that.
Now, why do you think that is?
They wanted to be mature. There's a lot of people who thought in the late 80s, beginning of 90s, that death metal is a thing that's, like Markus said, a teenage thing, a phenomenon that you will be growing out from. This is just a phase. And for most of people, it was maybe that, but for the true ones, no, never.
Yeah, I definitely heard that growing up.
Yeah, and then when I started my first death metal band in 1995, there weren't anybody left. And even the guys who had been in death metal bands kind of like looked down on me, like, why? Why do you want to play something like that? So it was definitely gone very much downhill at that point. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to actually write this book was to explain to myself why it went that way, like it went.
So you've made numerous mentions to the Finnish scene dying. Would you mind elaborating on what you mean by that? What form that took?
I can take this one. 1992, 93 was kind of the thing when I was thinking more about something else musically than death metal. And I think the big impact was actually from Seattle, something called grunge. Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, and Soundgarden and bands, Nirvana, bands like that, they had a really big impact on the death metal scene. And you could also hear things in bands that were existing under their original name in Finland as death metal bands. They kind of implemented these same kind of guitar riffs and groove to their own music as well, even if they were not growling as much as earlier. But the guitar riffs, you can hear it from Disgrace, you can hear it in Xysma, you can hear it, Kings of War kind of adapted it from maybe more like Kings of War or something. But the grunge was taking over big time. And we even quit the whole Festerday thing because of the grunge was taking over. And we formed another band doing something like grunge style with a little bit more metal kind of attitude. So it really had a big impact.
Yeah, that's true. I remember I interviewed Olli from Xysma, and he remembered the moment when guys from Dismember were over to Turku and hang around with guys of Xysma. And then they were listening to Nirvana album, and they actually were a little bit ashamed looking at each other because they had to admit that the Nirvana album was actually, the first one was actually a lot better than many of the death metal albums that were coming out at the time. So I think, yeah, Seattle had a big impact on the Finnish scene. And a little bit later, the Norwegian black metal. Then when black metal manifested itself in Finland, I think it was really intolerant for the scenes that had been before it. So when people got into black metal, they didn't want to hear anything about thrash metal or death metal. So I suppose, that was the final blow, death blow for Finnish death metal when, Dark Thrones and Emperor started to have their say.
After grunge, the grunge thing was maybe a thing in Finland, or at least for me, it was maybe a, 7 to 9 month thing. And after that, when the Norwegian black metal came in, it came like a fucking tsunami. It came almost as ugly as in the 80s. And, it's a fucking circus.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, everything goes in cycles, and we're kind of coming out of this old school revival period. But if you notice, a lot of these bands that were doing like old school revival, like maybe 8 or 9 years ago, are now doing like kind of 70s influenced prog metal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the entire cycle is playing out all over again.
Yeah.
Old school death metal is turning into, more commercial kind of, I don't know.
Five-Finger Death Punch.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's going to be a grunge revival, and right after that there's going to be a new metal revival.
Yeah.
And then we'll be back where we started.
But you can hear that also in black metal because the synthwave thing, kind of dungeon music is back, and this kind of 80s soundtrack music is back, and also the symphonic black metal has come back. And what's next? Maybe industrial techno death metal is coming back again. Who knows?
So just to give you the opposite perspective, the period that you're describing as the death of Finnish death metal is actually the period where I started discovering all these bands. And, it is interesting to me that the first time I heard bands like Xysma or Convulse, they weren't considered primitive, brutal, old school death metal bands. They were these strange kind of proggy, groovy, 70s influenced metal bands. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, the antagonism that you're describing from the black metal scene, I remember that very clearly. And I also remember having friends who were much more in the camp of black metal and believing that death metal is, death metal is old, death metal is bad, death metal is whatever. And my reaction, as somebody who had only really started listening to death metal at that point, was basically to say, fuck you. I'm going to get all the old school death metal albums. It's, it's not dead to me. Death metal might be dead to everyone else, but it's not dead to me. And I think almost as these scenes, and it wasn't just Finland, it was basically like everywhere in the world had some kind of version of what you're describing. Like bands that used to be fast and brutal were becoming groovy or becoming 70s influenced or something. And it kind of pushed people like me to kind of almost live in a tunnel, like live in a time warp where all I wanted was like the original Death albums, the old Carcass albums, like all that kind of stuff, both for Benediction, stuff like that. And eventually you saw a resurgence in the death metal scene. Like maybe, I don't know about Finland, but I noticed like old school death metal bands started coming back, or at least like very brutal death metal bands started coming back almost by like 98, 99. In terms of Finland, when did the scene start to surge?
Well, first of all, that was also my story because around '93 I was still involved in punk scene, and from punk it was fast forward to thrash metal, and from thrash metal to Sepultura, and from Sepultura to Morbid Angel and Obituary. So
yeah.
When everybody else was getting into black metal, I actually collected a huge thrash metal collection because these guys were selling all the classic albums. but so that's the timeline. But as far as the resurrection goes, in late 98, 99, the brutal death metal bands were, I think, mostly coming out from USA at the time. There was Angel Corpse, Cannibal Corpse was still going on strong, Nile. But in Finland, it took almost 10 years still, So I think it started to bubble under around something like 2006 and fully manifest around 2009, 2010 to fully, have the death metal scene back. So, but then, of course, it has come back with full force. And in 2021, we have a new generation of these 17-year-olds with flannel shirts who just play morbid, obscure death metal and don't want to listen to anything else. So I think, it's our book came out by accident in a good time because I think these people would be really interested to read about what went on, decades earlier on, and how the people who were in the original scene were actually a lot like them. So I would say, that.
Yeah, there are a lot of the youngsters bands who have been starting like 2006 or later. There's a lot of youngsters who are actually really, really dedicated to the scene of death metal, and I think that's really a good thing that they're still living in the past kind of a way, but in a updated kind of a cycle. But I don't know. I don't. If you ask me about bands from the 2000 and forward, I maybe know two bands. I actually stopped listening to death metal when maybe 93 or something, and everything from after 93 is garbage.
Do you know if there's a reason why around 2006 there started to be this resurgence in the death metal scene, the Finnish death metal scene?
why it started to bubble up in 2006 or so. That's a good question. So I think there was some kind of an overall old school sound revival going on, like Celtic Frost coming back, and Possessed started playing shows again. And,
But
I think it kind of like woke up the people who had been to death metal in the 90s and kind of like realized, hey, we can still do death metal, maybe.
But also these kind of social media, like Facebook and Instagram especially, people wanted to do more and more these kind of do-it-yourself approach things. And you can see that on Instagram especially, even nowadays. And that's where I think my first reaction was to see when things started to, people wanted to get this kind of a nostalgia from things that had been in the past and doing it again. And I can still see it on Instagram every day, that people are really kind of the do-it-yourself thing that is pretty much what death metal was in the beginning, tape trading and pen paling and sending over some magazines here and there and covering bands in Xerox-copied magazines. That was everything, do-it-yourself, pretty much imported from the old 80s, 70s, 80s punk scene.
So that's actually a fair point, which I think people should think about. Younger people listening to this podcast probably won't remember a time when you couldn't just type in the name of an obscure metal band and the name of their demo and immediately be taken to a YouTube page. But I think a lot of this old stuff that was, ridiculously hard to find back in the day. I mean, at least back in my day, there weren't a lot of people who had access to this stuff. And so tracking it down was very difficult. But, circa 2007, 2008, once you had like YouTube, MySpace, Facebook, whatever, all you had to do was, and Google, of course, it can't discount the importance of Google. If you're looking for one obscure Finnish demo, pretty soon you can find dozens, if not hundreds of them. And so that must have had some kind of effect, if not, within the scene in Finland, at least outside for the people who were interested in this stuff.
That's very true. Before Google, different bands were appreciated, in different towns, because back in the day when somebody bought an album, everybody, borrowed it and taped it. And for example, when I was talking to guys from Hooded Menace who are from Joensuu, and I was from Middle Finland, for example, Coroner was not very much appreciated where I was growing up because nobody had their albums. So that after Google, the gate was wide open. You could find anything. And then I think around the same time, there is a couple of active people who started downloading old Finnish demos around maybe 2007. So there are a couple of channels in YouTube where you can find almost everything. So I think that's actually a very, very good point.
And the thing what comes to YouTube is the thing that nothing is sacred anymore.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
When we were young and you kind of, if, for example, Xusma sent me a rehearsal tape, it was like, I would only show it to my band members, not anyone else, because we wanted to keep it to ourselves. And if I bought the first Morbid Angel album, no one in town had it. It was like, hey, can I tape it? Can I have it on tape? No, you can't. It's mine. And that way, when I look at, when I open YouTube, of course it's good they have the old shit there because people can listen to it, what it sounded like back in the days. But in a way, it's not sacred anymore because it's for everyone. And a lot of people, when I read, you should never read what they say, comment on YouTube, because there are a lot of great demos or debut albums that youngsters are typing, this is shit. And I was like, what the fuck, man? This is the best album I've ever heard. So in that way, nothing is sacred.
What would you say that the state of the Finnish death metal scene is now?
At the moment, just before COVID situation broke up in Europe, there was a festival in London, just like purely concentrating on Finnish death metal. And they had a bunch of older bands like Demolish and Pertinence, and also modern day current Finnish death metal bands. And, that was quite a respective, thorough set of different kind of Finnish death metal bands there. And kind of like opened my eyes that there are a lot of very strong bands, but also the good point is that they are not directly trying to copy, let's say Funebre, for example. So instead, there are no second class Amorphis around or third grade sentence going on. So instead, they are more like trying to still today to find their own sound. Let it be doomier or more aggressive or whatever. So even, or a little bit proggy like Voivod thing with Lantern. So yeah, I think modern day Finnish death metal scene is going on strong, and it's almost like 3 generations thing. There are the bands that they were there right in the beginning. Then there are bands that started 10 years ago. And then there are these new demo level bands that people are mainly underaged, or barely 18. And there's a lot of strong demos coming up at the moment. So it's almost like 3rd generation of Finnish death metal that is coming up. And that's kind of humbling when you think of it. It's kind of like it has survived despite in 1991, everybody was saying that it's not going to last more than 2 years. So when you're comparing that statement, it's been quite a respectable ride.
But also the Finnish scene at the moment is pretty strong with these young new bands. We have a lot of talented and good original bands in Finland. But I'm not sure if the scene is the same way in all countries. I don't know if Sweden has strong young death metal bands, because I'm not really that much into the scene kind of thing anymore. But in Finland, I know these youngsters because of Helsinki Death Fest, and we have been playing together with them and so forth. So I'm kind of started to know them pretty well. So I know their material and they have good things going on. But I'm not sure if the case is the same in all other countries. I guess so.
The thing that strikes me about Finnish death metal, not just the number of bands, the number of new bands that have come out, like let's say in the last 10 years or so, but the number of bands from outside of Finland that have or compare themselves or describe themselves as being, Finnish sounding or influenced by old school Finnish death metal. Have either of you guys noticed that?
Yep, I've heard about that.
And even though I think, there are more old school Finnish death metal sounding bands outside Finland than there is in Finland at the moment. Because, I don't know, for some reason Finnish people don't like copying or repetition too much. So, like if you have numerous forms, for example, in USA that sound a lot like the early Turku. Sound a lot like those early Turku bands, Disgrace. And so it's quite interesting, like you said, the early Finnish death metal sound is so sought after in a way by these younger people.
I mean, besides interesting, do you have any other thoughts on that phenomenon, or at least the popularity of Finnish death metal outside of Finland?
I think popularity of Finnish death metal has always been bigger outside Finland than it has ever been in here.
And bigger than people here even think.
Yeah, that's true. One of the reasons we wanted to do the book is to have some mainstream guy actually to pick up the book and realize that, Finnish death metal bands are quite globally known, even though nobody in Finland seems to care. So, like, if you think of Demolish, for example, they did one album in 1993, and they are still touring over it. So, I suppose that speaks a lot.
One album that hardly anybody heard, right? Like that Demolish album. Like when I heard that Demolish album, it was because the band themselves had put it up online. Like this was before SoundCloud and MySpace and Bandcamp and stuff like that. And so they just created a website to host their own album because there was no other way for people to hear it.
That's true. And when Netspins came out, nobody understood it. It wouldn't be fair or correct to say that it was widely celebrated album in 1993 because it was so, forward thinking and so obscure. So I think it needed, to have the technical death metal to develop until people could really appreciate what the guys from Kuopio were doing back in the day.
And even if Demolish debut album was released on Necropolis Records, I think, and Paul didn't quite of distribute that album very much because he was getting more and more into black metal, and I think that's one of the reasons why he kind of left everything about what concerns marketing on Demolish on side.
Demolish was already split up actually when the album came out. So.
I am curious, when you hear a band from outside of Finland that's obviously drawing so much influence from those early Finnish recordings, and the members are probably wearing old school Finnish death metal t-shirts in their band photos, what is your reaction?
Maybe it's kind of like, it makes me wonder, really. Like, I'm surprised. I'm always surprised because when living here in Finland and growing up here, you kind of like have this idea that death metal is very marginal. Finnish death metal is very like underground and marginal thing that barely anybody knows. And then you see a new band from, say, USA with pertinent shirt, or a band from South America with the heritage shirt. So it definitely it's really takes me always by surprise for some reason. To almost like in the early 90s when you saw Sepultura's Arise music video and Max was wearing a Finnish punk shirt in it. So maybe it's this Finnish mentality thing that we don't really expect our bands to go anywhere as why globally aware kind of a way. So I think I'm personally always surprised when I meet somebody in let's say I go to mainland Europe and I see somebody wearing an Intel Nazarene shirt. So yeah, maybe it's a mental thing.
And also the Finnish punk scene is really big in Japan. You can see, I'm running a small 7-inch label with a friend of mine, and we get a lot of mail from Japan asking about new demo tapes instead of 7 inches. So we have started to make demo tapes and cassette formats instead of 7 inches just for Japan. And we make really marginal kind of releases, and copies are maximum 50 copies. And we made a couple of weeks ago a really old, from the 80s, crust band from Finland, 30 copies of that cassette tape. The guy from Japan, a distributor, bought every single one of them.
Dude, Finnish hardcore is super big in Malaysia as well.
Yeah.
There was a crust band, I don't remember what they're called now, but they came and they played the little punk venue where we have all our shows. I'll try to remember the name, but like it was a big deal when they came over here.
Yeah.
Bands like Terves Kädet and Rattus and those, they're really, also in Brazil. I just recently discovered from YouTube punk band from Brazil that sings in Finnish, even though they don't speak Finnish. That's mainly just to Terves Kädet. So that's humbling.
So, Rotting Ways to Misery, The History of Finnish Death Metal, is the book that Kim and Markus wrote. Fellas, tell everybody how they can order the book. What's the best way to get this?
You can order the book from Cult Never Dies, for example, directly if you wanted to deliver in Europe. There's also a lot of wholesale in Europe. One of the places in USA is Hell's Headbangers. I know that have, the Cult Never Dies edition on store. But also, Decibel is putting out their own version of the Rotting Ways to Misery for USA readers, because the postage is of course quite a big deal when you order it from England to USA. So they are releasing 1,000-copy edition of USA version of Rotting Ways to Misery. It has a different cover art, a little bit different layout, but as far as the book goes, it's for exactly the same kind of a book. So yeah, there's a USA version coming up soon, and then there's also distributors working over the Cult Never Dies edition. So it should be around a lot, and if you don't see it in your local metal stores, for example, just ask for it, because I know there's a distributors working over it, largely due Brexit. So it should be, all the stores should be able to get it if you ask them, so, or just order it directly from Decibel or Cult Never Dies.
And if you just write the Rotting Ways to Misery in Google, you will find a lot of distributors, so like Amazon and Nuclear Blast and yada yada yada.
And you can find some old Finnish death metal demos too.
Yeah.
I should point out that Cult Never Dies also has a shirt that you can order along with the book. And I understand that you guys put out a limited edition zine, a couple issues of a zine, along with the book.
Yeah, we did a zine as a gift for the pre-orders. So it has those younger Finnish death metal bands reviewed in a old school zine way. So it's kind of like a time warp, have those young bands written about in a way of 1990 or 1991.
Now that's because they could not be featured in a magazine like that back in the day. So now they got the opportunity to be featured in a similar Xerox copied kind of a zine. And we can tell about this, Markus, what's coming up here. The thing about this scene was featured in this book. That was actually the issue 1, but we are working on issue 2 and 3 at the moment. The old-fashioned way magazine.
Yeah, doing a Xerox zine was actually so much fun. So yeah, we're definitely gonna do new editions later on of the Rotting Ways zine.
And will these future editions also be available through Cult Never Dies?
We cannot tell yet.
Okay, fair enough.
You will be informed. You will be informed when we have it done. So at the time we're mapping out bands who are willing to take part, and then coming a little bit, the zines will be a bit more thematical. So we're kind of like talking through the thematics on which will be how the second issue will be, and how the third will be.
And the interviews we are doing with bands, we are not talking about the band itself, what new releases they have or what new band shirts they have. We are talking about the persons in the band, what they are in person, not in the band. So it's going to be really deep kind of interviews.
Because there's a thing, like me and Kim know these people quite well, so we can actually go a little bit deeper. So we can talk to them about, issues that people don't know that much. So I hope, the scene will be we'll have some information that is probably not going to be around anywhere else.
And we will put it up on the Rotting Ways to Misery Facebook when we have the news coming out.
How else can people get updates about future editions of the book and the zine and other things related?
Only via the Facebook at the moment.
Yeah, I think Facebook, everything that's revolving around the book will be up in the Facebook. So I recommend people to follow that. So that's me and Kim doing it. So it's going to be really straightforward and right from the source. There's no extra hands dealing there. So all the information that you see in there is very much close to the core. So
yeah, and it's all official.
Yeah, so that's the best way to follow what's going on with the book.
Very cool. Now, before I let the two of you go, one additional question.
Oh, thank God.
I need each of you to list 5 essential Finnish death metal releases. So they can be albums or they can be demos, but recordings that you feel were extremely influential and will give people a good idea of what the Finnish death metal sound is all about. We'll start with Markus.
Well, we did a little list on the book because we really wanted to avoid the Nora Roberts kind of author representations that books usually have. So ours got a lot more like old taste zine kind of a thing. But yeah, I think my number 1 pick is actually not from the early days, but it's Exit by Rotten Sound.
Interesting.
And it's also a little bit more on the grindcore side, but that was the time when there really wasn't anything going on as far as the old school death metal thing in Finland went, but only Inferia and Rotten Sound were going from those early days. And when they did release that album in 2005, and it's really intense and as good as any early Finnish death metal album or grindcore album. So that was really like giving me a lot of hope and faith that there maybe one day there can be, another another group of Finnish death metal bands that are as good as the early ones were. Then I'd say first Unholy album, because it's really forward-thinking and exceptional, and it has amazing vocals and amazing tunes. Well, you have to mention the Demolish album, of course, because I think in a way it was like the pinnacle of the whole Finnish death metal movement. It's kind of like that was the point in 1993 when they reached the high level. And what else? Well, the first Amorphis album, that was personally, the Karelian Isthmus was really important for me personally. And then what else? Maybe I would pick also another teenage favorite. That would be the first Sentenced album. Maybe I go with these 5.
Cool. Kim?
I would agree on Demolish debut album and the Demigod Unholy Domain demo. And I also would add Mordicus demo, the first one, Abomination of the Earth, and also Coprophilia's first demo, and Xysma's first demo, The Swarming of the Maggots, and also Swallow the Symmetric Swab, which was the Lubricant first, it was the second demo, third one. And and Wings from Finland, their first 7-inch is one of the best ever done in Finland.
Very cool. Is there anything else you guys want to say?
How you doing?
I'm great. I very rarely in my life get to spend an hour and a half talking about Finnish death metal. So this has been.
We can make a rerun tomorrow.
hey, I'm down. You know, it is interesting. It is interesting to me because I think as I was getting into this stuff, you know, there was a lot of attention paid to other bands coming from other parts of Europe, and you know, besides some of the bigger bands in Finland, I didn't hear a lot about this stuff. It's only really been in the last 10 years that I've been finding out more of some of these obscure bands that came out of Finland, and I think it's great what you guys are doing, or what you guys did, I should say, putting together this book, because when I first started getting into this stuff, like the only way you'd find out about like the history of the entire Finnish death metal scene was, you know, month to month buying various magazines or various zines, and you had to piece together the entire history yourself over the course of like 10 years or something like that. And so I think I look forward to the day when I have an entire library of Swedish death metal, Finnish death metal, Polish death metal, you know, all these different books that I can just pull off and hand to people, and, you know, maybe retire the podcast because there will be nothing left to say.
Thanks. Well, the reason we wrote the book is that we get never tired of talking about Finnish death metal. So that was fun, and I'm really happy how people have been reacting. You know, the book. At least now it is obvious that it needed to be done, because we've got people from Mexico and from Japan, Australia, all across the earth, who have personally written to us and thanked that we did the book. So it's something we never really, we didn't expect something like, we couldn't expect, you know, that kind of a personal, warm response from people. And then it's been really heartwarming. And I agree that we actually managed to do something right this time.
I could add that instead of, you know, you remember a person called Elizabeth Bathory.
Yeah.
She was bathing in Virgin's blood. And you know Uncle Scrooge from Donald Duck?
Uh-huh.
He's bathing in money. I'm doing the same with Finnish death metal flyers.
And so I think you have the other two beat, right? Because nothing is better than that.
And before we end this conversation, I have to say that you have to play one of the old Entombed songs in remembrance of Petro.
Yeah, of course. So this podcast is going to come out a few weeks after our conversation, but I should point out that LG Petrov from Entombed died a few days before our conversation, and so I think a lot of people, at least within our scene, at least within our world, are thinking a lot about him. I don't know, do you want to add anything about LG or Entombed?
Well, they came to Finland a lot of times, and Entombed were super cool in a way that they also played really small towns and small places in Finland. I guess they just didn't want to do Helsinki and Turku and Tampere all over again, you know. So you could see them play in a very small, obscure place in Finland, and I really respect them for that. You know, so they took their, you know, world-class death metal to smaller places in Finland too, you know. So that's something you have to really appreciate. And LG, well, LG is the legend. You know, you couldn't find a friendlier and more down to earth guy, you know, from death metal scene. So he will be missed. He definitely will be missed.
I have a small anecdote to put in about LG here. The first time I met him, I made an interview with him. I used to run a Finnish metal magazine in Finland called Inferno magazine, and my first time I made an interview with LG was, I always wanted to surprise the persons I interview with something special. And I bought him one beer in a bottle and a big tin can full of pig meat and 5 kilos of potatoes. And he was like, what the fuck? The next day he had a big interview in the national radio station, and the girl who was interviewing him asked, what is the most odd present you have ever gotten? And he referred to me with the fucking 5 kilos of potatoes. So it was pretty funny. He was a funny guy.
Excellent. Yeah, I only met LG briefly at a few shows when I was living in New York. But as you said, he was a very down-to-earth guy. He loved being around his fans, you know, very friendly. He loved being on tour, and he loved what he did.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Rest in peace, LG.
Definitely, yeah. You will be missed, but always remembered.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. This was definitely a lot of fun.
Indeed.
Let me see those fucking hands in the air, come on! Everyone, come on, in the back! Thanks, good night.